1968, Southern England. This photographer, who is turning his back to us, indifferent to what is going on around him, is Bernd Becher, photographed by his wife, Hilla. Together they have embarked on a seemingly modest project of their own, to make a photographic inventory of the vanishing industrial world. Their work would influence several generations of photographers. 2007, New York. A photograph sells for a record $3,300,000 at an auction. The photographer's name is Andreas Gursky, a former student of the Beschers. Between these two extremes lies the story of the Düsseldorf School of Photography. The end of the 1960s marked the end of the reign of coal and iron in Northern Europe. Steel mills and mines were shutting down one after the other. A certain part of society, a certain part of the landscape was undergoing a radical change. In order to preserve the memory of this disappearing world, two young German photographers, Bernd and Hilla Becher, set out to systematically photograph the industrial structures that were slated for destruction. They would spend their lives traveling to Germany, Belgium, France, and the United Kingdom to collect thousands of pictures of blast furnaces, pit heads, and water towers. Their oeuvre is unique and goes far beyond simple data collection. The Beschers photographed the facilities when they were not in operation. They weren't interested in showing what they did, but what they were, compositions whose forms were solely functional, and whose beauty was all the stranger since it was totally unintentional. Their work also had a more militant goal. The Beschers wanted to liberate photography from its expressionist meanderings and bring it back to a very strict documentary objectivity. In order to capture the truth of reality as it is, and not distorted through the prism of the photographer's eye, they imposed strict rules upon themselves. This one, for example, might have been their subject. Restrictions included no human activities or anecdotes, no color, no foreground effects, blurring, playing with reflections or other artistic effects, no off-center placement, strange details, abstract or picturesque compositions, no wide-angle lenses that distort perspective or oblique angles. The entire object must be inside the frame. To avoid any type of distortion, the camera must be centered both vertically and horizontally. In addition, the photographs were taken in winter, in overcast weather so as to avoid the sun and the interference of cast shadows, as well as cloudy skies that embellish the background and detract from the intelligibility of the subject. In other words, objectivity required the elimination of all the aspects prized by what was then called subjective photography, embodied, for example, in this photograph by Otto Steinert, in which the only thing that matters is the expressionist interplay of lines and contrasts. The rigorous documentary style of the Beschers can be traced to other traditions. That of the American photographer Walker Evans and his frontal shots of America in the 30s. That of the new objectivity movement in Germany in the 20s. And the photographs of August Sander, his archetypal portraits of people of the 20th century, as well as criminal identity photographs, front view and side view. Taking the latter as a model, the Beschers shot buildings such as this coal bunker from 8 different angles, or every 45 degrees. Displayed together, these images formed what the Beschers called an unfolding. In another kind of arrangement, the same type of buildings were displayed, such as these water towers pinned side by side like insects on a naturalist's mounting board. The Beschers called these grids typologies. The variations were infinite, and the elegance of the composition mattered more than scientific rigor. In the 1960s, these typologies were recognized as works of art in themselves. They were awarded the grand prize at the Venice Biennale in 1990 in the category of sculpture. In 1976, Bernd Bescher was hired to teach photography at the Art Academy in Düsseldorf. He and Hiller would go on to train several generations of photographers. This informal group came to be known as the Düsseldorf School of Photography. The Bescher students, in spite of their different approaches, have retained a few characteristics that are common to them all. First and foremost, the apparent signs of objectivity, frontal views, straight lines, a certain distance, if not coldness, slightly warmed up by the constant use of color. A photograph from Thomas Ruff's series, Interiors. Another widely shared characteristic is a penchant for grandiose decors in which human figures play a very secondary role. The Abbey Library of St. Gallen by Candida Hoffer. Finally, they systematically work with very large formats. This print of Andreas Gursky's PCF is 3 meters high and 2 meters wide. Produced by state-of-the-art technologies developed in the 80s by a laboratory in Düsseldorf, such prints enable photography to compete with painting on the walls of galleries and museums. The student who has remained truest to the Beschers in spirit and in black and white is Petra Wunderlich, with her series on religious buildings in New York. The camera is at the right height, the parallels are strict, the horizontals and verticals perfectly straight. But the buildings she photographs are not isolated as they are in the Beschers' pictures. They are photographed as part of the facades. They are not volumes in space, but simple surfaces, differentiated only by their central position within the flatness of the image, in which architectural features contend with religious symbols and tags. The streets are deserted. Nothing of anecdotal interest to distract the eye from the composition. Only the trash bags left on the sidewalk vaguely evoke some sort of human presence. Other configurations are more complex. The composition becomes asymmetrical. The posters at the top of the picture accentuate the feeling of flatness and the strangeness of the structure. If the Greater Bible Way Temple had been situated in the middle, everything would have been easy. But as chance would have it, it was located at the end, forcing the photographer to decenter the entire composition and include a glimpse of the street in perspective, which would have been unthinkable for the Beschers in order for the temple to stand out. Prague. The National Memorial on Žižkov Hill, a monument from the 1930s. During the communist era, this is where the party's grand funeral ceremonies were held. Whereas the Beschers always photographed the external structure of buildings, as if, for them, there was a connection between exteriority and objectivity, Candida Höfer began to apply their principles to interiors. There's a change in focus, from working with objects to working with space. Here, the frontal position and absence of distortion go hand in hand with the rigid monumental lines. The structure of the image is based on the structure of the building and strictly adheres to the rules of perspective. The symmetry is impressive, but not perfect. Someone has moved the rows of chairs. Very slightly, but enough for it to be visible. It might have been the photographer, or it might not have been. But she definitely noticed and wanted this slight irregularity, which makes the atmosphere seem even more oppressive. In this photograph by Candida Höfer, an off-center angle would have given more depth to this classroom at the Collegium Helveticum in Zurich. The frontal position chosen by the photographer instead flattens the space and gives the impression that everything is situated in the same plane, on which a set of basic geometrical shapes rendered white by the incoming light can be perceived. Rectangles. A triangle whose bottom angle is marked by the chair. The circles of lights that seem to float like balloons, giving an unexpected feeling of airiness and charm to this bare room. On the other hand, the harshness of the backlight, the glowing lamps and their reflection accentuate the severity of the architecture in the Bregenz Art Museum designed by Peter Zumthor. The compositional use of light is an essential feature of these images that portray a certain atmosphere rather than the objective reality of the place. The photographs of Thomas Struth add a new ingredient to these deserted spaces: human activity. These impromptu shots taken in famous museums are structured in terms of depth. The paintings in the background, which are clearly visible and perfectly straight, dominate the scattered and randomly situated visitors. The eye follows the movement of the people, who are always admiring the works with their backs turned. A woman pushing her baby stroller seems to be walking toward the Parisians painted by Caillebotte, as if they both existed in the same world. At the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, Struth uses a different strategy. He frames the subject off-center in order to give us a better sense of the space, and emphasizes its theatricality by adding a group of posing figures. The desire to control the image, which is what guaranteed for the Beschers a documentary-like objectivity, leads to its opposite: staged photographs. A figure, a fisherman going fishing, placed on the embankment line in a Ruhr Valley landscape by Andreas Gursky, the most famous student of the Beschers. Gursky is the photographer of extremes, of emptiness magnified by this tiny silhouette lost under an enormous bridge, or on the contrary, of outrageous excess. In 1993, he photographed this building in Montparnasse, a residential machine 200 meters long, 16 stories high. Photographing it from the street was impossible. There would be too much distortion. To avoid that, Gursky went up to the roof of the building across the street. This grid with its hundreds of windows, all of them identical and all of them different, is like one of the Beschers typologies, a gigantic typology that is made up, however, of a single image. The size of the exhibition print, 4 meters by 2 meters, allows viewers to have a panoramic vision of the geometrical whole from a distance, and then move in and have fun exploring all the little details. He may show the reality of the building, but not the reality of the image. The picture has been doctored. From the roof of the building across the street, Gursky was only able to eliminate vertical distortion. Horizontally, the camera's field of vision was too narrow to capture the entire length of the structure, forcing Gursky to photograph each side separately and then put them together by computer. seamless manipulation of digital images has since become a permanent feature of his work. What could be more realist in appearance than this mass of garments hanging from the ceiling of a locker room in a German coal mine? The picture was taken in a real mine with real miners and real clothing hanging from the ceiling. Gursky photographed them several times in different arrangements, but always from the same distance, the same angle, and in the same light. That's as far as reality goes. The final image was created by computer. It is a montage using many different photographs from which Gursky selected the garments he wanted in order to fill in the empty spaces and fabricate this congested, hyperrealist image. Like Montparnasse, the photograph was made to be examined from different viewpoints. It is only up close that one discovers at the bottom of the picture the figures of several miners, who were also photographed separately, hiding behind the fine chain curtain, figures whose presence is meant to be felt more than seen. Gursky is always seeking to make things larger than life. Here he plays with the contrast between the monumental dimensions of a neutrino observatory in Japan and the scientists in their little dinghies. This is once again a montage. The figures were photographed separately and reduced to almost half their size so as to make the difference in proportion seem even more spectacular, an effective technique used by the Romantic painters back in the 19th century. In Cathedral, the reference is even more explicit. It depicts a romantic vision of the Middle Ages, with a little group of filmmakers standing in for pilgrims, a large pile of dirt suggestive of darkened vaults and rays of light filtering through the stained glass windows whose colors have been erased by Gursky to accentuate their spirituality. But he has removed more than just the stained glass coloring. This is what the inside of the Chartres Cathedral where Gursky took the picture looks like. No matter how you look at them, the windows are always partially hidden by thick pillars in the nave and separated by sections of stone. However, in the souvenir shop on the way out, a postcard display of the individual windows placed side by side catches the eye. It wouldn't be hard to imagine that this is what gave Gursky the idea of eliminating the pillars and stone sections and using only the windows to make up this stunning, although highly improbable, wall, whose size is once again magnified by the tininess of the human beings. Here, reality has become nothing more than the raw material that the photographer freely manipulates in order to make it correspond to his or her vision. This is an older version of 99 cent, which became the most expensive photograph in the world in 2007. Needless to say, the figures in this American supermarket are all fake customers. The pillars and shimmering ceiling were added later, and the colors of the products recreated by computer. As in the world of advertising, reality no longer exists here. The artist can do whatever he or she wants as long as it remains invisible. Thomas Roof also likes to manipulate images, but he exposes the manipulation. Self-Portrait, 1991. Of all the Dusseldorf School photographers, he is the only one who has worked on portraits, with this series which he initiated in 1981 and pursued for 20 years. Young men and women, always of the same age, facing the camera against a neutral background, framed in exactly the same way without any expression. There's nothing that conveys their inner self. The image is completely superficial, like an ID picture. This procedure, applied to 189 portraits and printed and exhibited in formats that are over 2 meters high, is exactly in keeping with the principles taught by the Beschers. An avid reader of technical and popular science magazines when he was a boy, Roof always liked to experiment, to tinker with image-producing devices of any kind, like this identikit machine called a photomontage synthesizer, which was used by the German police in the 1960s. He located one of them in the police museum and decided to try it out. Since the police refused to lend him their records, he fed the portraits from his first series into the machine, which proceeded to give birth, through a system of mirrors and lenses, to a host of new creatures, the faces of people who had never existed. Entitled Other Portraits, this series experiments with the contours of our identities and is associated for Roof with Dr. Frankenstein, as well as with sperm banks. In 1990, Roof discovered another way of viewing the world. Images from the first Gulf War aired non-stop on television channels everywhere, showing American soldiers in night combat using infrared technology that enables them to see in the dark. Roof obtained one of these infrared devices and used it to photograph Düsseldorf at night. Very simple pictures, banal urban landscapes in which nothing in particular is happening. But the greenish tint immediately makes them suspect, as if they were scenes of past or future crimes. By making the invisible visible, these new technologies turn us all into detectives or voyeurs. Roof explores another type of voyeurism by delving into the stream of virtual images circulating on the internet. In a series called Nudes, he appropriates pornographic images found on the web and blurs them to make them appear more acceptable. It's a way of challenging the dogma of documentary precision, which, Roof seems to be saying, is what is mainly responsible for the obscenity of the images. Degrading and degraded images. For another characteristic of Internet images is that they are poor in terms of information. In his series entitled JPEG, Roof exaggerates this deficiency as a way of exposing it, revealing the basic components of any digital image, the tiny monochromatic squares that are called pixels. This is a new form of documentary objectivity. If images cannot capture the reality of the world, the only thing left is to show the reality of the images themselves. This reality is no longer physical. Images are now nothing more than arrangements of information that can be easily transformed or manipulated. For the Beschers, photography was by nature a documentary undertaking. From the moment it was born, its connection to reality was guaranteed by the technique itself. That is no longer the case today, but what photography has gained in terms of freedom, it has lost in terms of innocence.